Chapter 4. King Solomon, one of the founding fathers of modern socialism. If you haven't noticed, grassroots America has experienced a resurgence or a real revival in modern socialism. And I understand why a lot of young people have embraced this idea, because it is such a sharp contrast to the corporate greed that has fueled a lot of the injustice that they have witnessed in our world today. And I can see how socialism would appear to be an easy fix to all this, to put the government in control of everything and everybody works for the common good. And when the day is done, all the wealth is equally, distributed. Well, I never really saw King Solomon as one of the founding fathers of modern socialism, but to be true to the historical record in the Bible, I'm afraid that he was. Now, we need to define our terms here. Socialism is packaged and sold under a variety of models. There is what we call free market socialism, where the country still operates on a free market economy, but people pay, heavy taxes for government services they perceive to be, free from the state. And then, of course, there is what we call pure socialism, where everyone serves the greater good of the state, and the final objective of everything is that everything everybody does is ultimately to benefit the economy of the state. Well, Solomon at this time saw himself as operating under a theocracy and kind of an appointed king that had been guided by the law of Moses. And so he started out serving God, but somewhere along the way he realized he could use the same system to kind of serve himself. And I think Solomon was a perfect example of a guy that started really well with God, but through vain pursuits eventually kind of lost his way. Now, there are two types of stories in the Bible, some that unfold in a single chapter and some that cover half a lifetime. The story that we're going to look at here in this chapter unfolds between 1 Kings chapter 4 and about 1 Kings chapter 12, and it covers a little more than 20 years. And the story of Solomon embracing what we would call a socialist style of leadership actually starts with him taking over the throne that his father David had left behind, and he starts by setting the stage to build the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon had a plan, and what he does is something that was actually quite revolutionary for his time. He appoints 12 district governors over the nation of Israel, and each one of them was responsible for supplying the king with daily provisions for 1 month out of each year, what we would call the equal distribution of financial responsibility. Now, this is always the first step in a socialist society. You pay your fair share and support the king. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Pay your fair share and support the king. Well, let's look at what they were responsible for. Solomon had quite an appetite. Solomon's daily provisions, and this was for him and all the people that worked under him, daily provisions were 5.5 tons of flour, 11 tons of meal, 10 grain-fed cattle, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, 100 goats, some deer, gazelles, roebuck, and choice fowl. And it was also the job of the district governors to bring their proper quotas of barley and straw for all the animals, because Solomon had 4,000 stalls of chariot horses and 12,000 riding horses. Everything the guy did, he did in excess. Now, this was really a good deal for old Solomon, but how did it work for the nation? Well, let me put it to you this way. Socialism, the best metaphor I could give you for socialism would be what I would call like a junior varsity airplane pilot. There's always a great takeoff, but there's usually a pretty bumpy landing. And this is exactly what happened to Solomon. But I want to read to you, there's 3 snapshots in the Bible. There's 3 quotes that talk about how good this worked right off the beginning. And it always works good at the beginning, but let me give you these 3 quotes. Here's the first one. The people of Israel were as numerous as the sand of the seashore. They ate, drank, and they were happy. Okay? No one was left in the dust. Everybody ate, drank, and they was happy. Okay, here's the second quote. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety. Okay, everyone felt safe. Everyone under their own vine and everyone under their own fig tree. Okay, now there's 2 things you want to get from that statement. Number 1, Solomon made everybody feel safe. And second of all, he made everyone feel prosperous. See, the statement, everyone lived under their own vine, their own fig tree. See, this was free market socialism. See, he made everyone feel prosperous and safe. Okay, that's a good thing for a leader to do. Now, here's the third quote. It says, the district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to the king's table. And they saw to it that nothing was lacking. Okay, let's read that one again. The district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon, and all who came to the king's table, they saw that nothing was lacking. Okay, if you worked for the king, that was a fantastic job. Full provision for the state, nothing was lacking. If you worked for the king, nobody went hungry. So, everyone had everything they needed, and the nation was at peace. This was the dawn of a new era. Life was grand, and this is where the story, though, unfortunately, takes a hard turn for the worst, okay? You have to impose the question, Solomon had just taken over the throne from his father David. This temple in Jerusalem that he's getting ready to build here took 7 years to build, so that's quite a project at any level. How did he pay for this? How did he come up with the money? Well, he didn't really pay for it. And this is where the story takes an interesting turn. I want to enter into the story here a guy by the name of King Hiram, who was the reigning king of Tyre during Solomon's reign. And after Solomon had been anointed to succeed his father David, this King Hiram sent a delegation to Solomon to make sure that they would stay or remain on good terms because he had been on good terms with his father David. Now, this is a paraphrased version of the letter that Solomon sent back, but this is where Solomon kind of makes a move on this guy. And this is what he does. Solomon says it's really hard to build a temple when you're at war with neighboring countries, but now that God has granted our nation a season of peace, he says, I think this is the hour for me to build the temple. And he pitches a deal to this King Hiram, and this was the deal. He says, you send me all the pine and cedar logs that I need to finish this project, and I will pay you whatever wages you decide. Well, here's the deal they eventually settle on. Basically what it amounted to was you supply me with the logs to build whatever I want to build, and I will trade you an equal amount of grain and olive oil, and here's a record of the deal. In exchange for all the timber, Solomon sent King Hiram 125,000 bushels of wheat every year and 115,000 gallons of olive oil. Okay, basic deal. You send me the logs and the raw materials I need to build my crystal cathedral here in the city of Jerusalem, and I will supply you with grain and oil, and neither one of us have to produce the money, right? Life is good. Just kind of barter for barter. Well, let me give you one little side note, too, here, and this is the part that's interesting to me as an old tree climber. The one statement that really jumps out in this whole story, and I quote here from the Bible, there was no one as skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians. And they were the people that dropped all these, harvested all these pine and cedar logs that were sent to Solomon. So it's the only place in the Bible that specifically talks about lumberjacks and tree climbers. So hey, a man after my own heart. Anyway, as we continue on here, as you might imagine, King Hiram was really excited about this no-bid contract. There's really no way I can lose here. I don't have to produce the cash. I just trade goods and labor for trading goods and labor, right? So Hiram writes him back and says, let's do it. So here's what no one saw coming. The only way that Solomon could really fulfill his end of the deal is with what the Bible calls conscripted labor. Okay, you know what conscripted labor is? It's probably what we would refer to in our vernacular today as being drafted. Okay, you're not really a slave, but you're considered a trader if you take off and run. So what does Solomon do? He puts together, this is the way the Bible, 30,000 general laborers to work at the nation's expense, 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stone cutters, 3,300 overseers, all over, and here's the point, that the reason all those numbers are in there is to show you that government under Solomon became very, very big business, okay? And so it's important to note too, and I want to inject this, Solomon did a few things right too. Let me give you an example of one of the things he did right. He sent off workers off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 men a month and then had them return home for 2 months so they wouldn't get burnt out and they wouldn't get cranky. So he did a few things right, okay? But anyway, 7 years later, the temple's done. Well, here's again where the story takes another odd turn. This is where Solomon went wrong. God told Solomon to build a temple. He did not tell him to build a royal palace for himself. He built that royal palace for himself, and the dimensions tell a profound story. Solomon's temple was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Solomon's royal palace was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The point being, his royal palace was exactly twice the square footage of the Lord's temple, okay? An obvious lesson there, right? Now, I want to do a quick lesson, too, here on human psychology. I don't know if you've ever heard the term megalomania. It's a word to describe a variety of behaviors in modern psychology, but the definition that it's mostly pegged to is what we would refer to as getting bit by the building bug, Okay, the pharaohs in Egypt had it really bad. The Caesars in Rome had it really bad. King Solomon had it really bad. There's been many modern examples of people that had it really bad. But it's kind of an obsession with not wanting to be forgotten, so I'll leave a bunch of brick and mortar behind that bears my name. Well, here's what happened. After spending 7 years building the temple, I think Solomon felt like he had really hit his stride as a general foreman. And I think he struggled with the question of, once I shut this construction machine down, how am I going to reboot this thing if I ever want to build this royal palace for myself? So he's got to keep this thing going, okay? He's got to feed the machine, right? So when Solomon started this project 20 years earlier, he never thought that it would take this long to finish. But it wasn't like this is the 10th one he ever did. He was kind of learning as he went. And what Solomon, and the other question too is, what would Solomon do when all these orders stopped flowing in? See, how would he dry this monster up? Well, after spending 13 years building this royal palace, he had stretched his credit to the limit with all the foreign nations around him. He finds himself in a huge financial mess, and he desperately needs to get out of it. Now, the obvious question would be, if Solomon was trading labor for goods, how did he get himself into a big financial mess? Well, the Bible actually gives us an incredible window into that question. And here's the answer. There are 2 very large shipments of gold from King Hiram to Solomon that are recorded in 1 Kings chapter 9. Now, what's interesting about that is the Lord's temple, the temple he built, was finished in chapter 7. So this shipment of gold that he ordered was not to finish the temple, it was to finish his own royal palace. You see, you don't need gold to build something structurally. You need gold to build something fancy. Okay? I think this is where Solomon started to see himself as a queen instead of a king. I think he was drunk on excess. And this was the proverbial Y in the road where Solomon started to see himself as something that he really wasn't. Now, I want to read you these 2 shipments of gold. The first one was 4.5 tons, and in today's economy, that comes out to about $150 million. And the second shipment was about 16 tons, which has an estimated a value of about $612 million, which, if you add those 2 numbers together, comes out to about $762 million. Now, that's a lot of money, folks, to spend on interior decorating, isn't it? And here's a brief description of his royal palace, and then a second home he built to impress one of his wives, who happened to be Pharaoh's daughter. It says, he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling, and Solomon also made a palace like this for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he married. Let me just say for the record, guys, trying to impress a woman will get you in trouble every single time. Now, I want to pay careful attention here to the words also used to describe the materials he used for the construction of his royal palace. And I'm just going to touch on some of the high marks here because it's kind of a lengthy thing. But I just want to pull out a few sound bites out of this. Okay, blocks of high-grade stone cut to size, smooth on their inner side and outer faces, large stones of good quality. Okay, verse 11, high-grade stones, dressed stones, trimmed cedar beams, yada, yada, yada. See, the point is the guy had expensive taste, and everything he did 5-star hotel kind of stuff. Well, eventually, though, it caught up with him. And Solomon finds himself in a desperate situation. His creditors are crawling all over him, so what does he do? Well, have you ever heard the phrase that a desperate need is a dangerous need? Well, what he does is Solomon actually bamboozles King Hiram in a shady business deal. And what he did is Solomon got the nation of Israel into such a mess, the only thing he had left to barter with was the dirt under his feet. So here's what he does, he liquidates. And Solomon trades King Hiram the 20 coastal towns along the Sea of Galilee as kind of a buyout plan to get his creditors off of his back. Now, this land that he sold him, these towns that he sold him, today would be known as beachfront property. Do you remember a financial advisor, Larry Burkett? The first question he would always ask is, do you have anything you could sell? Now, here's, I guess you could say, the theological point, the real biblical point. If you get anything out of this chapter, get this. Solomon had to sell part of the promised land to settle his own personal debt with a foreign nation. That is what a financial mess this guy got himself into. Now, I would say, shame on you, Solomon. That was not your land to sell. That land was God's inheritance to the Jewish people. And the worst part of all is that Solomon got Hiram to say yes to this deal before the guy even went and looked at it. And the text even makes it clear that after he saw these towns that he sold him, he was stunned. And King Hiram actually names the place Kabul, which in Hebrew means good for nothing. You see, Solomon did not sell him the fertile plains of Mesopotamia or the city of Jerusalem or his own royal palace. What he did is he went out and he found the poorest people in the land of Israel, and he sold those people out from underneath himself to a foreign nation to settle his own personal debt. That, ladies and gentlemen, is really cold. Now, this poses a tough question. Let's just say hypothetically that this nation, we ever found ourselves in a similar situation that, we had to settle our debts. What would someone like our current president have to sell besides the dirt under our feet to get us out of the economic mess that he was in? And what would he sell? Well, I guarantee he's not going to sell New York City or Los Angeles or Miami or Dallas. What would he do? He would find the 20 most economically oppressed places in America, and he would sell those to a foreign nation to get us out of the mess that we're in. And you would wake up tomorrow under foreign rule. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, here's the thing. I don't think this is going to happen in the next 15 minutes, but I guarantee you, if America continues on the course that we've been on for the last 50 years, I guarantee you, we're eventually going to be there. Do you think that when Solomon laid that very first block at the temple that he ever foresaw the day when he would have to sell part of the promised land to settle his debt with a foreign nation? I guarantee you, he never saw that day coming. You know what the Apostle Paul makes an interesting comment in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 where he says everything that happened to the nation of Israel, everything that happened in the Old Testament was given to us as an example, okay? That we might learn from these things and not repeat the mistakes of our ancestors. And I believe that this little story here in the Bible is a prophetic word for America, that if we don't wake up, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have our day of reckoning also. Now, I did some research on this to the best of my ability. Are you aware of the fact that we owe China $1.5 trillion? And we owe Japan $1.3 trillion. Ireland, $270 billion. The Cayman Islands, where a lot of our hedge funds are kept, $262 billion. Brazil, $258 billion. Switzerland, $240 billion. Luxembourg, $227 billion. The United Kingdom, $217 billion. Hong Kong, $189 billion. Okay? And then you have what's called unfunded liabilities, like government pensions, where you've got more money going out than coming in. And the estimates on that are mind-boggling. They range from about $80 trillion to about $200 trillion. Now, the question I want to impose on you this morning is if we ever had a complete economic global downturn and all the nations of the world called in their debts against us, what would our president have to sell besides the dirt under our feet? Ladies and gentlemen, that could be a very dark moment in American history. Let me give you another snapshot into Solomon's reign and what he did as a leader. This is a direct quote from the Bible, 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 15. It says, during his lifetime, Solomon made silver and gold as common as stones in Jerusalem. Do you know why that verse is in the Bible? What it's telling you is that everyone felt rich. Okay, everyone was not necessarily rich, but he made people feel rich. See, everything seemed good for a long time, but the king overextended himself. Now the nation is falling apart, and he's grabbing for straws. Oh, does that sound familiar? The story actually gets worse. In 1 Kings chapter 11, Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam, now there's two characters in this story, Rehoboam with an R, who was Solomon's son, and Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's prominent leaders. Rehoboam succeeds Solomon as a king. And Solomon had exploited the people so harshly that some of them fled the country and just left. And if that wasn't bad enough, one of Solomon's most prominent leaders, a man named Jeroboam with a J, fled to Egypt just to get away from Solomon and this dictatorship that he had created. Does that sound familiar also? But when Jeroboam heard that Solomon was dead and his son Rehoboam succeeded him as king, he returns to his homeland and he tried to start a new life, and he tries to renegotiate a new beginning with the king's son. And I think he hoped that Rehoboam would have learned from Solomon's mistakes and started leading with his heart and not just leading with his ego. So Jeroboam gathers all the leaders of Israel together, and he approaches King Rehoboam just with the facts. And this is what he says. He says, your father laid a heavy yoke upon us, and we are here to ask you to lighten the harsh labor, and we will be your servants. All they were asking for was to be treated with a little bit of dignity. Well, King Rehoboam told them to go away for 3 days, and I'll give you my answer. Well, Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served under Solomon, and they told him, this is what they told him, this is an exact quote. If you will just serve these people and give them a dignified answer, they will be your servants for life. What the old men was telling this young king was get off on the right foot. The elders made it very clear this is not a rebellion, this is just a renegotiation. Lead with your heart, don't lead with your ego. Well, obviously not satisfied with their answer, he calls in the young men that he had grown up with. He asked them the same question. And this is what the young men told him. They said, you go tell them that our father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions. And Rehoboam rejected the counsel of the elders and embraced the counsel of these young men. But you know what? It all backfired on him. Here's what happened. There was a man named Adoniram who was in charge of conscripted labor. He was kind of like the head guy over all the people that were doing hard labor for King Solomon. And King Rehoboam went back to him and told him to crack the whip and get these people working again. And they ambushed him and they stoned him to death. The nation revolted. You know, in the words of Andy Stanley, a leader who refuses to listen will eventually find himself surrounded by people who cannot hear. I want to give you one other important insight into this too. You know, Solomon never drafted any of his fellow Israelites into this conscripted labor program. All the people that worked in this conscripted labor thing were all descendants from the land of Canaan. And this is why after Solomon died, a civil war broke out and the nation unraveled in a very short period of time because he created a powder keg between two separate people groups, okay? And just so we don't forget too, you know, when you hear somebody tell a story like this, you think, wow, Solomon, what an old fool. Well, let's never forget that the Bible paints a very different picture of King Solomon. The Bible says he was indisputably the smartest human being that ever lived. You know, the wisest man in the East, wiser than all the men of Egypt. His fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He had 3,000 proverbs he could quote from memory and 1,005 songs. And he understood everything there was to understand at that time about plants and animals. And people came from every nation of the earth to sit and to listen to this guy's wisdom, okay? So let's never forget, ladies and gentlemen, this was an intelligent man that did this. And this story does not cover 3 centuries, it covers 20 years. But the golden era of Jerusalem was gone and peace was traded for turmoil. And I just want to say, if there's any young people out there listening to the sound of my voice right now, you be very leery of leaders, kings, and politicians who promise you things on the backs of hardworking people. I know they mean well, but they never see the end game. And in the words of Margaret Thatcher, the problem with socialism, you always eventually run out of other people's money to spend. One last thought. I'm convinced that Solomon had a change of heart in his old age, because if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it actually reads more like a diary than a theology book. I see an old man laying on his bed at night, just kind of writing down his thoughts. And I want to read you the first and the last statement he makes in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. He starts out by saying this. He says, the words of the teacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. And at the end of chapter 1, this is what he says. He says, I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom much more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me, and I have experienced much wisdom and knowledge. And then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also to madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing of the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and with increasing knowledge comes increasing grief. I think Solomon is saying there is, I got everything I wanted in life, but in the end, it killed my soul. King Solomon, one of the founding fathers of modern socialism.